Sometimes life gives you one last chance when you need it most. For Maxwell Thornley, that chance came in a letter about a castle he never knew existed. The 47-year-old mechanic had spent decades fixing engines and raising his son alone, always one bill away from disaster. When a lawyer said he'd inherited a stone castle in the woods, everyone in town laughed. They called it a ruin not worth the drive to see it. But Maxwell and his son Lachlan went anyway. What they found was worse than anyone said. Collapsed roof, broken windows, floors you couldn't trust. Then Lachlan lifted a rotting board and discovered a locked chest hidden for over 100 years. Inside were documents pointing to something in the walls worth millions. But what would finding it cost them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maxwell Thornley's hands were never clean. 25 years of working under car hoods had stained them permanently, oil ground into the creases of his palms, calluses thick as leather on his fingers. He'd tried pumice soap, industrial cleaners, even let his son Lachlan talk him into some fancy citrus scrub one Christmas. Nothing worked. The stains were part of him now, like the ache in his lower back or the way his right knee clicked when he stood up too fast. The garage sat on the edge of Riverside, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business and quiet enough that most folks liked it that way. Maxwell had bought the place in 1998 with money borrowed from his late father and had been paying it back ever since. First the bank, then the equipment suppliers, then the parts distributors, then the tax man. There was always someone waiting for their cut. The building itself was nothing special. Cinder-block walls painted a faded grey, 2 service bays with lifts that groaned when you raised them, and an office that doubled as a waiting room with 3 mismatched chairs and a coffee maker that only worked if you hit it just right. But it was his, or would be in another 6 years when the last loan finally got paid off. Maxwell had opened the garage at 7 that morning, same as always. Checked the appointment book. Mrs. Chen's Buick needed an oil change. The Reverend's pickup was due for inspection, and somebody's teenager had brought in a Honda with a check engine light that probably meant a bad oxygen sensor. Standard Tuesday work, the kind of reliable, unglamorous labor that kept the lights on and food on the table. His son Lachlan had shown up around 8 with coffee from the diner down the street. That was new. Lachlan had only been back in Riverside for 3 weeks, having returned from the city with nothing but a duffel bag and a story about a tech startup that hadn't started up. Maxwell hadn't pressed for details. His boy was 26 years old enough to lick his own wounds in private if he wanted to. "Morning, Dad," Lachlan said, handing over a paper cup. "Black coffee, no sugar." At least the kid remembered how his father took it. "Morning? You didn't have to do this." "I know. Wanted to." Lachlan looked around the garage with the expression of someone trying to find something positive to say about a place that had seen better days. "Thought maybe I could help out today. Learn the trade a bit." Maxwell studied his son over the rim of his coffee cup. Lachlan had his mother's dark hair and sharp cheekbones, but he'd gotten Maxwell's build, tall and lean, the kind of frame that looked good in a suit but needed to fill out if you wanted to do real work. He was wearing jeans and an old flannel shirt, trying to look the part. "You sure about that? This isn't computer work. It's dirty and it's hard on your back. I'm sure. Besides, what else am I going to do? Sit around your apartment and feel sorry for myself?" That got a small smile from Maxwell. "All right then. But you do what I tell you when I tell you. This isn't a democracy, it's a garage." They worked through the morning, Maxwell showing Lachlan the basics. How to properly jack up a car, where to place the stands, how to drain oil without making a mess. The kid was clumsy at first, dropping tools and cross-threading a drain plug, but he kept at it without complaining. That counted for something. Around 11, Betty from the post office came by with the mail. She was a solid woman in her 60s who'd been delivering mail to Riverside for as long as Maxwell had lived there. She knew everyone and everything, which made her either a valuable source of information or a dangerous gossip, depending on your perspective. "Morning, Maxwell." Got something official-looking here?" She handed him a stack of envelopes with one thick cream-colored one on top. "Return address says it's from some law office up in the city." Maxwell's stomach tightened. Official letters were never good news. Either someone was suing you or the government wanted more money. He set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a shop rag before taking the envelope. "Probably nothing," he said, though he didn't believe it. Betty lingered, clearly hoping he'd open it right there so she could report back to the diner. Maxwell gave her a polite smile and waited until she took the hint and left. "What is it?" Lachlan asked, coming over. "Don't know yet." Maxwell tore open the envelope and pulled out several pages of dense legal text. His eyes skipped over the formal language until he found the core of the message. Then he read it again, slower, making sure he understood. "Dad, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maxwell looked up at his son. "I inherited a castle." "You what?" "A castle. Says here a distant cousin named Alistair Thornley died last month. No immediate family, so his estate went searching for next of kin. Turns out I'm it." He flipped through the pages. "Place is called Greymore Castle. Built in 1847, located about 3 hours north of here in the forest." Lachlan took the letter and read it himself. "This is real. An actual castle? That's what it says. There's a key included and everything." Maxwell pulled out a large iron key that had been wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of the envelope. It was old, heavy, the kind of thing you'd see in a movie about medieval times. "Dad, this is incredible. Do you know what a castle is worth?" Maxwell held up a hand. "Don't get ahead of yourself. Keep reading. Says here the property has been abandoned since the 1960s and is in significant disrepair. Translation, it's falling apart. Still, it's a castle. Even if it needs work, the land alone must be valuable. Maybe, or maybe it's a money pit that'll cost more to fix than it's worth." Maxwell folded the letter and tucked it back in the envelope. "Either way, I suppose we ought to go look at it. See what we're dealing with." Word spread through Riverside faster than a brush fire in August. By lunch, half the town had heard about Maxwell's inheritance. By dinner, everyone had an opinion about it. At the diner that evening, Maxwell and Lachlan sat in a booth picking at meatloaf while locals stopped by to offer their thoughts. Most of them weren't encouraging. "Greymore Castle. I know that place," said Bill Hutchins, who ran the hardware store. "My uncle did some logging up that way back in the 70s. Said the castle was already a wreck then. Roof caved in, walls crumbling. Not worth the stone it's built from. Probably full of mold and rot," added Martha Quincy, the librarian. "Old buildings like that, once they've been empty for a few decades, there's no saving them. You'd spend a fortune just to make it safe enough to tear down." Even Reverend Paul, usually an optimist, seemed doubtful. "I don't mean to discourage you, Maxwell, but these things rarely turn out to be the blessing they appear. More often they're a burden. Something else to drain your resources." Maxwell listened to all of it with a patient expression, nodding and thanking people for their concern. But inside, a small spark of something he hadn't felt in years was starting to glow. Not hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous, too likely to disappoint. But possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, life had dealt him a hand that wasn't all bad cards. Lachlan was less diplomatic. After the fifth person had predicted disaster, he set down his fork with more force than necessary. "You know, for a town full of people who claim to care about each other, you're all pretty quick to rain on someone's parade." "Lachlan," Maxwell said quietly. "No, Dad, it's true. You've lived here your whole life, worked yourself half to death keeping everyone's cars running, and the minute something good might happen, everyone lines up to tell you why it won't work out." The diner went quiet. Martha Quincy looked offended. Bill Hutchins suddenly found his coffee fascinating. Reverend Paul broke the silence. "The boy's got a point, Maxwell. We're a cautious people. Sometimes too cautious." He stood and put a hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "You go look at that castle. See for yourself. Who knows? Maybe it'll surprise you." That night, back at the small apartment above the garage, Maxwell and Lachlan sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread between them. "When do you want to go?" Lachlan asked. "Tomorrow. We'll close the garage for the day, drive up and have a look. If it's as bad as everyone says, at least we'll know. And if it's not?" Maxwell looked at his son, really looked at him, saw the hope there, the need for something to go right after his own plans had crumbled. "Then we figure out what comes next, together." Lachlan nodded. Together, they spent the next hour looking up what they could find online about Greymore Castle. There wasn't much. A few historical references to the Thornley family, some grainy photographs from the 1940s showing an impressive stone structure with towers and high walls. Nothing recent. It was as if the place had been forgotten, left to fade from memory along with the family that had built it. Maxwell went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his father, who'd worked himself to death in a factory. He thought about Lachlan's mother, who'd left when the boy was 7 because she couldn't handle the slow suffocation of small-town life. He thought about all the years of barely getting by, of choosing between fixing the water heater and buying winter coats, of pride swallowed and dignity stretched thin. Maybe the castle was nothing. Maybe the town was right, and he'd drive 3 hours to look at a pile of rubble. But maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to build something different. Not for himself. It was probably too late for that. But for Lachlan, a foundation, a place to start over. He fell asleep with the iron key on his nightstand, solid and real, proof that sometimes life offered more than you expected. The drive north took them through country that grew wilder with every mile. They left Riverside at dawn, Maxwell's old pickup truck loaded with basic tools, flashlights, and a cooler packed with sandwiches. Lachlan rode shotgun with a map spread across his lap, though they barely needed it. The directions from the lawyer's office were straightforward enough. Take the highway north for 2 hours, then follow a series of increasingly narrow roads into the forest. The landscape changed as they drove. Farmland gave way to rolling hills, then to dense woods of pine and oak that pressed close to the road. They passed through 2 small towns, each smaller than Riverside, each looking like prosperity had packed up and moved somewhere else decades ago. Boarded up storefronts, gas stations that might have been abandoned or might just have been empty that morning. It was hard to tell. "You ever been up this way?" Lachlan asked. "Once or twice. Your grandfather used to take me fishing in these mountains when I was about 10. Beautiful country, but remote. Not many people choose to live this far from civilization anymore. Seems like a strange place to build a castle. People built where they could back then. Maybe whoever started it was running from something, or running towards something. Hard to say." Maxwell kept his eyes on the road. The pavement had given way to gravel 10 minutes ago, and the truck bounced over ruts and holes. According to the map, they were close. Another mile, maybe 2. Maxwell felt his pulse quicken despite his attempts to stay calm. Whatever they found, he needed to approach it practically. Measure twice, cut once. That's what his father used to say. Look at the situation clearly, make a plan, execute it. Getting emotional never fixed anything. Then they rounded a curve, and there it was. Greymore Castle rose from the forest like something out of a storybook, except this story had taken a dark turn. The main structure was stone, massive blocks of grey granite fitted together with impressive skill. There were towers at each corner, though 2 had partially collapsed. The central building stood 3 stories tall, with narrow windows that stared out like empty eyes. Vines covered much of the exterior, thick ropes of green that had worked their way into every crack and crevice. The roof, or what remained of it, had caved in across large sections. Maxwell could see through to what must have been the Great Hall, open to the sky now, probably had been for years. Water damage would be extensive. Structural integrity was questionable at best. "Oh my God," Lachlan breathed. Maxwell parked the truck in what used to be a courtyard. Weeds grew waist-high through broken cobblestones. A rusted iron fence surrounded the property, though sections had fallen or been pushed over by falling trees. The place was utterly silent except for the wind moving through the pines. They sat in the truck for a full minute just looking. "It's worse than they said," Lachlan finally managed. "It's standing. That's something." Maxwell opened his door. "Come on, let's see what we've got." The main entrance was a massive wooden door, 12 feet tall and reinforced with iron bands. Maxwell pulled out the key from the lawyer's envelope. It slid into the lock with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been waiting for it. The lock turned with a deep clunk that echoed inside. The door swung inward on hinges that shrieked in protest. The smell hit them first: damp stone, rotting wood, and the musty scent of abandonment. Maxwell clicked on his flashlight and stepped inside, Lachlan right behind him. The great hall was even more impressive from inside, despite the decay. The ceiling soared 30 feet overhead, or had, before sections of it collapsed. Sunlight streamed through the holes, creating pillars of dusty light. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, big enough to roast a whole pig. The floor was slate, mostly intact, though covered in debris and bird droppings. "This was something once," Maxwell said softly. "Look at the craftsmanship. These stones were cut and placed by masters. They moved through the ground floor systematically. The kitchen was a disaster, the old iron stove rusted beyond repair, cabinets rotted and hanging off their hinges. A dining room still held a long table, though the wood was warped and split. What must have been a library had empty shelves along the walls, books long since taken or rotted away. Everywhere they looked, Maxwell saw money that needed spending. New roof, probably $200,000 if they were lucky. Structural reinforcement, another $100,000 minimum. Plumbing, electrical, windows, doors, floors. The numbers added up in his head like a mechanic's estimate that kept growing worse. "Dad, we should go upstairs," Lachlan said. "See if it's any better up there." The staircase was stone, which meant it was probably safe. Maxwell tested each step anyway, his weight shifting carefully as they climbed. The second floor held bedrooms, 8 of them by his count. Most were smaller than the rooms below, probably servant quarters. But at the end of the hall was a master bedroom that must have been spectacular in its day. Huge windows looking out over the forest, a fireplace, even a small adjacent room that might have been a private study. The study caught Maxwell's attention. Unlike most of the castle, this room had survived relatively intact. The roof here was solid. The window only cracked rather than shattered. A desk stood against one wall, and built-in bookshelves lined another. Debris covered everything: fallen plaster, leaves blown in through cracks, what looked like parts of a bird's nest. "Give me a hand with this," Maxwell said, moving toward a large bookshelf that had toppled forward onto the floor. They lifted together, muscles straining. The bookshelf was solid oak, heavy as sin. As they got it upright and leaned it against the wall, something about the floor caught Maxwell's eye. The dust pattern wasn't quite right. There was an outline, a rectangle where dust had settled differently. He knelt down and brushed away the grime. Floorboards, same as the rest of the room. But these had gaps around the edges, as if they'd been cut and fitted back in place. He pulled out his pocket knife and worked the blade into one of the gaps. The board lifted easily. "There's something under here," he said. Lachlan knelt beside him. Together they pried up 3 boards, each one coming loose without much resistance. Someone had made these removable intentionally. Beneath the floor was a shallow space, maybe 8 inches deep, and in that space sat a chest. It was wooden, bound with brass fittings that had turned green with age. About 2 feet long, a foot wide, a foot deep. Not huge, but substantial. And locked. A brass padlock hung from the hasp, old but intact. Maxwell and Lachlan looked at each other. "Should we try to open it here?" Lachlan asked. Maxwell considered. The chest was old, possibly fragile. Whatever was inside had been hidden for a reason, and had survived decades in this concealed space. Breaking it open with crude tools in a dusty castle room didn't seem right. "No, we take it back to the garage. Open it properly, see what we're dealing with. If it's just old papers or family mementos, fine. But if it's something valuable, we need to handle it right." They carried the chest down the stairs and out to the truck. It wasn't particularly heavy, maybe 30 pounds. But Maxwell held it carefully, conscious that he was carrying something that had been deliberately hidden by people now long dead. As they loaded it into the truck bed, Lachlan looked back at the castle. The afternoon sun was hitting it at an angle now, and for a moment the stone seemed to glow. Despite all the decay, despite the obvious impossibility of restoration, there was something noble about the structure. It had been built to last, and by God, it was still standing. "What do you think is in there?" Lachlan asked, nodding at the chest. "Could be anything. Might be nothing, old letters, photos, that kind of thing. Or it could be something important, something someone wanted to keep safe. Maxwell looked at his son and saw the hope there again, that dangerous thing. Don't get your expectations up. Whatever's in this chest, it's been there a long time. The real treasure, if there is one, is the castle itself. That stone, that land, if we can figure out what it's worth, maybe we can sell it, pay off some debts. You'd sell it without even trying to fix it? Lachlan, look at that place. It would take a fortune. We don't have to make it livable again. Sometimes you have to be realistic about what you can and can't do. But even as he said it, Maxwell felt the lie in his own words. Because standing there in the shadow of that broken castle, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, still not quite that, but the whisper of possibility, the sense that maybe the story wasn't over yet. They drove back toward Riverside as the sun set behind them, the locked chest rattling softly in the truck bed, holding secrets that had waited more than half a century to be revealed. The chest sat on Maxwell's workbench like an accusation. For 2 days it had been there, locked and silent, while Maxwell went through the motions of running his garage. He changed oil, replaced brake pads, diagnosed a faulty alternator. Normal work, predictable work. Work that didn't require him to confront whatever mystery that brass lock was protecting. Lachlan had less patience. "We should just cut the lock off," he said on the third morning, circling the chest like a dog around a bone. "No." Maxwell didn't look up from the carburetor he was cleaning. "That lock is over 100 years old. Could be valuable itself. We do this right or we don't do it at all. So what's right look like?" Maxwell set down his work and wiped his hands. "I know someone. Used to do locksmith work before he retired. If anyone can open that lock without damaging it, he can." Nigel Prescott arrived that afternoon in a pristine 1972 Chevelle, forest green with chrome that caught the light like jewelry. The man himself was 73, built like a fire hydrant, with white hair combed straight back and hands that still moved with surprising delicacy despite the arthritis that had ended his career. "Maxwell Thornley," he said, shaking hands with a grip that made Maxwell wince. "Been too long. I heard about your castle. Whole town's talking about it." "I'm sure they are." Maxwell led him to the workbench. "This is what I need help with." Nigel's eyes lit up when he saw the chest. He pulled on a pair of reading glasses and examined the lock without touching it. "Oh, this is beautiful work. Pre-Civil War, I'd say, given the craftsmanship. They don't make them like this anymore." He looked at Maxwell over his glasses. "You know what's inside?" "No idea." "Found it hidden under floorboards in the castle. And you want it open without destroying it." "That's the idea." Nigel pulled a worn leather case from his jacket pocket and unrolled it on the workbench. Inside were picks and tools, some so delicate they looked like dental instruments. "Let's see what we can do." Lachlan watched in fascination as Nigel worked. The old man's hands moved with practiced precision, feeling the mechanism through the picks like a safecracker in a movie. He hummed tunelessly under his breath, occasionally pausing to try a different tool. "You learn patience in this work," Nigel said without looking up. "Locks are like people. They don't respond well to force. You have to understand them, work with them, find out what they need." Maxwell found himself thinking about that. How many times had he tried to force solutions to problems in his life? Push harder, work longer, never ask for help because that meant admitting you couldn't handle it alone. And where had it gotten him? A garage mortgaged to the hilt and a son who'd come home defeated. There was a click. "There we are," Nigel said softly. He lifted the lock free and set it aside with reverence. "Now, before we open this, understand something. Whatever's inside has been sealed away for a long time. Could be fragile. We go slow." Maxwell nodded. His mouth was dry. Nigel lifted the lid carefully. The hinges protested but held. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, were several bundles. The cloth crumbled at the edges as Nigel lifted the first package. He unwrapped it slowly and papers emerged, old, yellowed with age, but surprisingly well preserved. "Letters," Nigel said, spreading them carefully on the workbench. "And look here, architectural drawings. The drawings were detailed, showing floor plans of the castle in precise cross-section. But some walls were marked in red ink, with measurements and notations written in cramped handwriting. Maxwell picked up one of the letters and read the date at the top, April 17th, 1889. The letter was addressed to my heir, whoever you may be. Maxwell's hands trembled slightly as he read aloud. If you are reading this, then I have passed from this world, and my secrets have found their rightful keeper. I'm Cornelius Thornley, master of Greymore Castle, and I write this in my 73rd year with the full knowledge that I am a thief and a coward. Lachlan leaned in closer. Keep reading, Maxwell continued. I have spent my life as a dealer in fine art, traveling the great cities of Europe and America, acquiring treasures for wealthy clients. But I was not always honest in my acquisitions. Some pieces I purchased fairly. Others I took through deception, through betrayal of trust, through methods I am now ashamed to recall. When my conscience finally caught up to my greed, I could not bring myself to part with what I had gathered. Instead, I hid it all within the walls of this castle, sealed away where no one would find it. The architectural drawings included here show the locations of these hiding places. I leave it to you, my heir, to decide what should be done with what I have concealed. The garage was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Nigel whistled low. Well now, that's something. Maxwell set down the letter and picked up the drawings, studying them with new intensity. The red markings showed hollow spaces within the castle's thick stone walls, secret compartments built into the structure itself. Beside each marking was a notation, sometimes just initials, sometimes full names of artists. Look at this one, Lachlan said, pointing to a marking in what appeared to be the library. Says Constable, 1821. That's John Constable, the landscape painter. His work is worth millions, Nigel finished. If it's genuine and if it's actually there, that's two big ifs. Maxwell pulled out more papers from the chest. Lists, inventories, what looked like bills of sale. Some were clearly legitimate purchases. Others had no documentation beyond Cornelius's own notation of where he'd acquired them. The word stolen appeared next to several entries written in the same cramped hand. He documented his own crimes, Maxwell said, still not quite believing what he was seeing. Why would he do that? Guilt, Nigel said simply. The man spent his final years trying to make things right the only way he knew how. He couldn't bring himself to confess while alive, so he left a confession for whoever came after. Lachlan was already pulling up information on his phone. Dad, if even half of what's listed here is real and still there, we're talking about, I can't even calculate it. 10 million? 20? Some of these artists, their work almost never comes up for sale. Maxwell sat down heavily on his work stool. His mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. They'd driven to the castle expecting nothing, found it in ruins, discovered a hidden chest, and now learned that within those crumbling walls might be enough treasure to change their lives forever. What do we do? Lachlan asked. We verify, Maxwell said slowly. We go back to the castle. We check these locations, see if anything's actually there. Could be Cornelius hid it all, and someone else found it years ago. Could be it's rotted away or been destroyed. We need to know what we're dealing with before we make any decisions. And if it's real, Nigel asked, if you find what he says is there? Maxwell looked at the old locksmith. Then I guess we'll have some choices to make. Nigel carefully packed up his tools. At the door, he paused and turned back. Maxwell, a word of advice. Discoveries like this, they bring complications. People you've never heard of will come out of the woodwork claiming they have a right to it. Lawyers, treasure hunters, distant relatives. Whatever you find in that castle, you keep it quiet until you've got legal counsel who knows what they're doing. Understand? I understand. After Nigel left, Maxwell and Lachlan spent the rest of the afternoon studying the papers. The architectural drawings were detailed enough that they could identify specific rooms and locations. The lists were organized, methodical, the work of a man who wanted his heir to succeed in finding what he'd hidden. As evening fell, Maxwell looked at his son across the workbench. We go back tomorrow, early. We check 3 locations, see if there's anything there. If we find even one piece that matches these descriptions, then we know it's real. Lachlan nodded. And if it's not, then we've got an old chest full of interesting papers and a castle we still can't afford to fix. Maxwell managed a small smile. Either way, at least we'll know. They loaded the truck before sunrise. The architectural drawings sealed in a plastic document protector. Basic tools, heavy-duty flashlights, a digital camera, and enough supplies to spend the full day at the castle if needed. Maxwell had barely slept, his mind running through scenarios and possibilities, until exhaustion finally pulled him under around 3 in the morning. The drive felt different this time. Last week they'd been tourists visiting a curiosity, expecting nothing. Now they were treasure hunters, though Maxwell hated thinking of it that way. It felt too much like greed, too much like they were hoping for something they hadn't earned. "You're quiet," Lachlan said, as they turned onto the gravel road. "Just thinking. About what Nigel said. About complications. You're worried someone will try to take it from us. I'm worried about a lot of things. Whether it's real, whether we have the right to it even if it is, whether finding it will solve problems or create new ones." Maxwell glanced at his son. "Money changes people, Lachlan. I've seen it happen. Good people who suddenly come into something and it poisons them. You think that would happen to us? I think we need to be careful. Keep our heads on straight. Remember who we are." The castle looked different in the morning light, less gothic and more simply sad. A building that had once been someone's pride, now abandoned and forgotten. Maxwell parked in the same spot as before, and they unloaded their equipment. Inside, Maxwell spread the architectural drawings on the great hall's stone floor, weighing down the corners with rocks. According to Cornelius's notations, the first hiding place was in the East Wing library. The drawing showed a false wall section, 2 feet thick instead of the standard 18 inches. They found the library on the ground floor, a long rectangular room with empty built-in shelves covering 3 walls. Water damage had warped the wood and stained the walls, but the structure seemed sound. Maxwell paced off the measurements from the drawing, then used a tape measure to check the wall thickness. "Here," he said, rapping his knuckles against the stone. "This section sounds different. More hollow." Lachlan pressed his ear to the wall and knocked in several places. "You're right. There's definitely a gap behind here." They worked carefully, using a small pry bar to remove stones from the wall's outer layer. The mortar was old and crumbled easily, which made Maxwell nervous about the whole structure's integrity, but grateful they didn't need power tools. After 20 minutes, they'd created an opening large enough to shine a light through. Maxwell aimed his flashlight into the gap. There was definitely a space back there, maybe 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. And in that space, wrapped in what looked like heavy canvas, were rectangular shapes. "There's something in there," he said quietly. They widened the opening until Maxwell could reach inside. His fingers found the canvas, still intact despite the decades, surprisingly supple. He pulled out the first package carefully, afraid it might disintegrate in his hands. On the floor of the library, they unwrapped the canvas, like archaeologists uncovering a tomb. The painting inside was dark with age, the varnish yellowed, but the image was clear. A landscape, pastoral and serene, with the kind of light that made you feel you could step into the scene. In the bottom right corner was a signature. Lachlan photographed it with his phone and ran a search. 2 minutes later, his hands were shaking. "Dad, that's a John Constable. Dedham Vale, painted in 1821. It's been missing since 1887. The art world thinks it was destroyed in a fire." Maxwell stared at the painting. It wasn't large, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, but it was exquisite. And even under the grime of age, you could see the mastery in every brushstroke. This was what Cornelius had hidden. This was real. "What's it worth?" Maxwell heard himself ask. Lachlan scrolled through search results. "Similar constables have sold for between 2 and 4 million at auction, but one that's been missing this long, with this kind of provenance, could be more. Could be a lot more." They sat in silence, looking at the painting. A piece of canvas and oil that represented more money than Maxwell would make in 10 lifetimes of fixing cars. Just sitting there on the dusty floor of an abandoned castle. There are more hiding places, Lachlan said finally. The drawings show at least 6 other locations. Maxwell carefully rewrapped the painting and set it aside. Then we check them. All of them. We document everything, photograph it, make sure we know exactly what we're dealing with. They spent the next 6 hours moving through the castle systematically. In the master bedroom, they found a false bottom in the fireplace hearth, concealing 3 smaller paintings and a set of ivory sculptures. In what used to be a dining room, behind a removable section of wainscoting, they discovered a collection of illuminated manuscripts wrapped in oilcloth. Every location marked on Cornelius's drawings yielded something: paintings, sculptures, rare books, objects that spoke of wealth and culture and careful preservation. By late afternoon, they had documented 9 major finds. Maxwell had photographed everything, taken measurements, recorded exact locations. The truck bed now held wrapped bundles containing more artistic and historical value than the entire annual budget of Riverside. They sat on the castle's front steps as the sun began its descent, eating sandwiches that tasted like cardboard because neither of them could focus on anything but what they'd found. "We need to tell someone," Lachlan said. "We can't just keep this to ourselves." "I know. We need lawyers, appraisers, maybe the police. This isn't something we can handle alone." "The police? Why?" Maxwell gestured back at the castle. "Because Cornelius wrote in his letter that some of this was stolen. We just found millions of dollars worth of art that might have been taken illegally over a century ago. We can't just sell it and pretend everything's fine. There are rightful owners out there, or their descendants anyway, but we're the rightful owners now. It was left to you, was it? If something was stolen from your family 100 years ago, would you want it back? Or would you be fine with whoever found it keeping it because enough time had passed?" Maxwell crumpled up his sandwich wrapper. "We do this right, Lachlan. We contact the attorney who sent us the inheritance papers. We get professionals involved who know how to handle this kind of thing. And we accept that we might not get to keep all of it." Lachlan was quiet for a long time. "You're a better man than most people, Dad. I'm just trying to be the kind of man I can look at in the mirror. Money's no good if you sell your integrity to get it." They loaded the last of the wrapped packages into the truck and locked the castle behind them. On the drive back, Maxwell found himself thinking about Cornelius Thornley, a man who'd spent his life taking what didn't belong to him, then spent his final years trying to make it right the only way he could, leaving a confession, a map, a plea for his heir to do what he'd been too coward to do himself. Maxwell didn't know if he was equal to that task, but he was going to try. The question was, what would happen when the rest of the world found out what they'd discovered? Maxwell's garage became something else over the next 3 weeks. The service bays still held cars in various states of repair, but the office had transformed into a makeshift archive. Wrapped paintings leaned against walls. The smaller sculptures sat on shelves Maxwell had hastily installed, and the documents covered every flat surface. He'd bought a dehumidifier and kept it running constantly, terrified that after surviving over a century, Cornelius's collection would be destroyed by moisture in a mechanic's garage. Felicity Drummond, the attorney who'd sent the inheritance letter, had driven down from the city the day after they'd called her. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and looked perpetually skeptical of everything. When Maxwell showed her what they'd found, her skepticism evaporated. "You need specialists," she'd said immediately. "Art historians, appraisers, conservators, and you need them yesterday." That's how Dr. Philippa Strand entered their lives. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a sensible sedan, a woman in her mid-60s with grey hair pulled back in a bun and the kind of energy that made you tired just watching her. She carried 3 different cameras, a laptop, and a leather satchel that probably cost more than Maxwell's truck. "Show me everything," she said by way of greeting. Maxwell and Lachlan spent the next 4 hours watching her work. She photographed each piece from multiple angles, took samples of paint and varnish where she deemed it safe, examined signatures under magnification, and made notes in a leather journal with handwriting so small it looked like code. The constable landscape made her actually gasp. Dear God, This really is the lost Dedham Vale. I wrote my doctoral thesis partly about this painting. The art world assumed it burned in the Hanover Street fire of 1887. She looked at Maxwell with something close to awe. Do you understand what you have here? Expensive paintings? Maxwell offered. History. Windows into the past. Artists' souls made visible. She turned back to the painting with reverence. And yes, also extremely expensive. This piece alone could fetch 3 to 5 million at auction, possibly more given its provenance. Lachlan did the math in his head. And there are 18 pieces total. Not all will be as valuable, but yes. Conservatively, I'd estimate this collection at $8 to $12 million. Possibly significantly more, depending on authentication and market conditions. Maxwell sat down heavily. Hearing it stated so baldly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. They weren't playing at treasure hunting anymore. This was actual life-changing wealth. The kind that solved every problem he'd ever had and created entirely new ones he'd never imagined. Dr. Strand spent the next week traveling between her university and Maxwell's garage, bringing colleagues to verify her assessments. Each expert confirmed what she'd found. The collection was genuine, valuable, and historically significant. The story of Cornelius's hidden treasure began spreading through academic circles, then jumped to the press. The first article appeared in the regional newspaper, Lost Art Treasures Found in Abandoned Castle. By the next day, it had been picked up nationally. By the end of the week, Maxwell couldn't walk through Riverside without people stopping him with questions, congratulations, or barely concealed envy. The phone calls started coming. Reporters wanting interviews, art dealers offering to broker sales, museum curators expressing interest in acquisitions. And then the calls Maxwell had been dreading, lawyers representing people claiming connection to the Thornley family. The first serious challenge came from a woman named Priscilla Ashworth. Her attorney's letter arrived by courier, formal and threatening in equal measure. It stated that Priscilla was descended from Cornelius Thornley's sister, Beatrice, making her an heir with equal claim to the estate. The letter demanded immediate cessation of any plans to sell or remove the art collection and threatened litigation if Maxwell proceeded without acknowledging her rights. Oh, how legitimate is this? Maxwell asked Felicity Drummond over the phone. Unfortunately, quite legitimate. I've reviewed the genealogy. She's definitely descended from the Thornley line, though through a different branch than you. Inheritance law in these situations gets complicated, especially with an estate this valuable. So what happens now? Probably years of legal wrangling, unless you can reach a settlement. And while the courts sort it out, everything gets frozen. You can't sell anything, can't restore the castle, can't touch any of it. Maxwell looked around his garage at the fortune in artwork that he legally owned but couldn't do anything with. There has to be a better way. There is. You negotiate directly with her. Come to an agreement before lawyers drain both of you dry in legal fees. That evening, Maxwell sat at his kitchen table with Lachlan and the letter from Priscilla's attorney. Outside, Riverside was settling into its usual quiet night, but inside, Maxwell's head was anything but quiet. I want to meet her, he said finally. This Priscilla Ashworth, face to face, not through lawyers. Is that wise? Lachlan asked. Probably not. But I'm tired of other people fighting over things that belong to a man who's been dead for 70 years. Maybe if we actually talk to each other, we can figure something out that doesn't involve courts and lawyers and years of fighting. He called Felicity the next morning with his proposal. She was skeptical but agreed to arrange a meeting. Priscilla, it turned out, was equally interested in avoiding a prolonged legal battle. They set a date for her to visit Riverside and see the castle, 2 weeks away. In the meantime, Maxwell made a decision. He hired a local security company to install a proper system at the castle and paid for regular patrols. The cost made him wince, but leaving millions of dollars in artwork essentially unguarded seemed foolish. He also contracted with Hugo Fairfax, a master carpenter in his 60s who'd been after Maxwell for years to let him work on something more interesting than kitchen cabinets. Just stabilize it, Maxwell told him at the castle. Make sure nothing else collapses. Don't worry about making it pretty yet. Hugo walked through the building with the eye of someone who understood old construction. This place was built solid, good bones underneath all the rot. With the right attention, it could be something again. Maybe. Let's focus on keeping it standing for now. The work began. Roofers patching the worst holes, masons shoring up unstable walls, carpenters replacing rotted structural beams. Maxwell tried not to think about the costs adding up. If the legal situation went badly, he'd be in debt for repairs to a castle he might not even get to keep. But somehow, watching the castle slowly stabilize felt right. Like he was honoring not just Cornelius's memory, but something larger. The idea that beautiful things deserved to be preserved, that history mattered, that walking away from something difficult wasn't always the answer. 2 nights before Priscilla Ashworth was due to arrive, Maxwell stood alone in the castle's great hall. The holes in the roof had been temporarily covered, and new support beams held up the gallery. It still looked like a ruin, but a ruin with potential. He thought about Cornelius, hiding his stolen treasures in these walls, about the weight of guilt that must have carried, about trying to make things right when you knew you'd done wrong. Maxwell understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Priscilla Ashworth arrived in a black Mercedes that looked out of place on Riverside's dusty main street. Maxwell watched from the garage as she stepped out. Tall, elegant, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage. Her driver remained with the car while she approached, her heels clicking with authority on the concrete. Mr. Thornley, her voice was cultured, the kind that came from expensive schools and careful upbringing. "That's me. Please, call me Maxwell." He extended his hand, and she shook it with a firm grip that surprised him. "Priscilla Ashworth, thank you for agreeing to meet directly. I find lawyers have a way of complicating things that should be simple. I've noticed that too. Would you like to see the castle?" "Very much." Lachlan joined them for the drive north. Priscilla sat in the passenger seat, taking in the landscape with an expression Maxwell couldn't quite read. She asked questions about Riverside, about his work, about how he'd come to inherit the castle. Her tone wasn't hostile exactly, but there was a wariness there, like she was trying to figure out what kind of man she was dealing with. When the castle came into view through the trees, she went quiet. They parked, and she stepped out slowly, taking in the structure with something close to reverence. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this place," she said softly, "how Cornelius built it as a refuge from the world, how the family would gather here for summers. I never thought I'd actually see it." Maxwell led her through the entrance. The interior still showed its damage, but the recent stabilization work had made it safer, more solid. Priscilla walked through the rooms with her hand occasionally touching walls, as if connecting with something she'd only known through stories. In the library where they'd found the first painting, she stopped. "My grandmother said Cornelius had the finest private library outside of Boston. Thousands of volumes. What happened to them? Gone, as far as I can tell. Removed or rotted away decades ago." She nodded, looking sad. "So much lost." They showed her the hiding places, empty now but still visible where they'd removed stones and panels. Maxwell explained how they'd found the chest, the confession letter, the systematic recovery of the collection. Priscilla listened without interrupting, her face thoughtful. Finally, she turned to face him. "Your attorney says you've been documenting everything, making sure each piece is accounted for." "That's right. Dr. Strand has been helping. Everything's photographed, catalogued, stored as safely as we can manage." "And you haven't tried to sell anything?" "No. Seemed wrong to do that before the legal situation was sorted out." Priscilla studied him for a long moment. "You know, when my attorney told me about this, I assumed you were going to try to hide assets, move pieces before I could stake my claim. That's what most people would do." "I'm not most people. No," she said slowly. "I'm beginning to see that." They sat on the castle steps, the three of them, while Priscilla processed what she'd seen. Maxwell found himself watching her, trying to understand this woman who'd come ready for battle, but seemed to be reconsidering her approach. "There's something else you should know." Maxwell said. He pulled out a copy of Cornelius's confession letter and handed it to her. She read it in silence, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock to something deeper. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back. He stole them. Half the collection is stolen. According to his own accounting, yes, he documented which pieces were legitimate purchases and which weren't. And you're planning to, what, return them? I'm planning to try. It's what he asked for, and it seems like the right thing to do. Priscilla laughed, but it wasn't a mocking sound. It was almost relieved. Do you have any idea how much money you'd be giving up? Some. Dr. Strand estimated the stolen pieces at about 4 to 5 million in current value. And you'd just... Oh, hand that over to people who probably don't even know the artwork exists. Maxwell shrugged. It's not mine to keep. Never was. Just because enough time has passed doesn't make theft into legitimate ownership. Priscilla stood and walked a few steps away, looking out at the forest. When she turned back, something in her demeanor had changed. The wariness was gone, replaced by something Maxwell recognized as respect. I came here ready to fight you, she said. My attorney has a whole strategy planned. We were going to tie this up in court for years if necessary. And now I think that would be a waste. She came back and sat down beside him. I'm wealthy, Maxwell. I run a successful consulting firm. I've invested well. I have more money than I need. I didn't come here because I'm desperate for cash. I came because Cornelius was my family too, and I didn't want to be shut out of something that mattered. You're not shut out. No, I can see that now. You're not trying to steal my inheritance. You're trying to honor it. She was quiet for a moment. What if we worked together? Split the legitimate collection between us. Share the costs of restoration. Turn this place into something that honors what Cornelius wanted. Maxwell hadn't expected this. You'd agree to that? I'd prefer it. Fighting over money, that half of which we can't keep anyway, seems pointless, but using what we can keep to restore this place, to make it mean something again, that seems worthwhile. They spent the next hour talking through possibilities. Priscilla had resources and connections Maxwell lacked. She knew people in the art world, had experience with foundations and non-profits, understood how to navigate the complex waters of cultural heritage. Maxwell had the practical knowledge of restoration, the connection to the local community, the willingness to do the hard physical work. We could create a foundation, Priscilla suggested. Use some of the proceeds from the legitimate sales to fund it. The castle becomes a museum and cultural center open to the public. The stolen pieces get returned to their rightful owners or donated to appropriate institutions. We honor Cornelius's last wishes while creating something that serves the community. Lachlan had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now he spoke up. What about the costs? Restoring this place completely will take millions. Then, we sell some of the more valuable legitimate pieces, Priscilla said. Or we seek grants and donations, or we open it partially and expand over time. There are ways to make this work, if we're creative. Maxwell felt something unfamiliar. Hope, real hope, not just the whisper of possibility. You really want to do this? Work together instead of fighting? Priscilla smiled. I really do. On one condition. What's that? I get to be present when we return the stolen pieces. I want to see Cornelius's redemption completed. I think he'd want family there for that. Maxwell extended his hand. Deal. They shook on it, and in that moment, the whole situation shifted from conflict to collaboration, from something divisive to something that might actually honor the complicated man who'd brought them together. The genealogy book had been sitting in Maxwell's office for 3 weeks, largely ignored while they dealt with more pressing matters. It was Lachlan who finally pulled it down one evening, looking for distraction from the legal documents Felicity had sent over for review. Dad, have you actually looked through this thing? He called from the office. Maxwell was under a Ford Ranger, replacing a transmission pan gasket. Flipped through it. Why? There's a lot more family history here than I expected. Goes back to the 1790s. Maxwell torqued down another bolt, his mind on the work. "Dad, you need to see this." Something in Laughlin's tone made Maxwell slide out from under the truck. He wiped his hands and went to the office where Laughlin had the genealogy book spread across the desk, open to a page dated 1847. "What am I looking at?" The book's spine was thicker than it should be. "I was just examining the binding when I noticed it felt hollow." Laughlin held up a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed but intact, the wax seal unbroken. This was hidden inside a false compartment. Maxwell's pulse quickened. "You didn't open it?" "Waiting for you." They moved to the kitchen table where the light was better. Maxwell examined the envelope carefully. The seal showed the Thornley family crest, a tree with deep roots, pressed into dark red wax. The handwriting on the front read simply, "To be opened by my heir." "That's Cornelius's handwriting," Maxwell said, recognizing it from the confession letter in the chest. "Same style." He broke the seal carefully and pulled out several sheets of paper filled with that familiar, cramped script. The date at the top read November 3rd, 1891. Maxwell began reading aloud. "To whomever inherits Greymore Castle and finds this letter, I pray it is someone of conscience and courage, for what I leave you requires both. The confession I placed in the hidden chest beneath the study floor tells part of my story, but not all of it. I was not merely a collector who overstepped ethical bounds. I was, in truth, a thief." Maxwell paused, glancing at Laughlin before continuing. "My career as an art dealer provided access to private collections, estates in transition, museums with inadequate security. I told myself I was preserving beauty, protecting masterworks from those who didn't appreciate them. In reality, I was stealing from people who trusted me. The inventory I left with the architectural drawings includes notations of which pieces were acquired legitimately and which were not. I was meticulous in this accounting because I hoped that someday someone would have the strength I lacked to return what I wrongly took." Maxwell's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the next page. "The attached documents provide everything necessary to identify the rightful owners or their descendants. Some pieces belong to museums I deceived. Others came from private collectors I betrayed. A few were taken from estates during my tenure as an assessor, when grieving families trusted my valuations without question. I list here each stolen piece, its origin and, where I know it, information about the family or institution from which I took it." What followed were pages of detailed provenance. Each stolen artwork was listed with not just its description, but its history. The Constable landscape had been taken from the estate of a widow named Catherine Pemberton in 1885, removed during an assessment, and replaced with a lesser copy. 3 smaller paintings had been stolen from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1882, when Cornelius had been contracted to catalogue their collection. A set of ivory sculptures had belonged to a collector named Horace Brennan, no relation to Maxwell, despite the similar surname, and had vanished from his home under suspicious circumstances in 1887. On and on the list went, each entry a separate act of theft, each notation a monument to Cornelius's guilt. The final page contained his plea. "I cannot undo my wrongs, but you can. Return these pieces to their rightful owners. Where families have died out, donate the works to appropriate institutions. Keep only what was legitimately acquired. I know this means surrendering millions in value. I know it means choosing integrity over wealth. But I beg you to do what I could not, make amends for my crimes. Let Greymore Castle stand not as a monument to my shame, but as a symbol of redemption. Should you choose this path, know that you carry my gratitude across the years and my prayer that this act of restitution brings peace to those I wronged." The signature at the bottom was shaky, as if written by a hand that had aged or weakened significantly. "Cornelius Thornley, September 1891. He died 3 months later, according to the inheritance documents." Maxwell set down the letter and looked at his son. Laughlin's face was pale. "Dad, this changes everything. Half the collection has to go back." "I know. But we're talking about millions of dollars. The Constable alone doesn't belong to us." Maxwell's voice was firm. "Never did. We're just temporary custodians with a choice to make. Lachlan stood and paced the small kitchen. Do you understand what you're saying? We could keep it. Nobody knows about this letter except us. We could sell everything, split it with Priscilla, and no one would ever know the difference. We'd know. Dad, think about what this money could do. Pay off the garage. Set you up for retirement. Give me a chance to start over properly. We've struggled our whole lives, and here's a chance to stop struggling. Maxwell looked at his son, really looked at him, saw the desperation there, the fear that had been hiding behind hope. Lachlan had come home defeated, and the discovery of the treasure had seemed like salvation. Now Maxwell was saying they had to give half of it away. Come here, Maxwell said quietly. Sit down. Lachlan sat, his jaw tight. When your mother left, Maxwell began, I had a choice. I could have tracked her down, made her life miserable, fought for every dollar of child support, or I could let her go and focus on raising you right. I chose the second path because I needed you to see that doing the right thing matters more than winning. This is different. Is it? This is about who we are, Lachlan. Not who we pretend to be, not who we wish we were. Who we actually are when nobody's watching except ourselves. Maxwell tapped the letter. Cornelius spent his whole life taking what he wanted, and it poisoned him. He died hoping someone would have the courage he lacked. I'm not going to fail him, even if it costs us millions. Even then, they sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Lachlan let out a shaky breath. I almost convinced you to keep it all, didn't I? When we first found the chest. Almost. But you didn't, and you know why. Because you're better than you think you are. You came home feeling like a failure, but you're not. You're just figuring out what success really means. Lachlan wiped his eyes roughly. So what do? We call Priscilla. We tell her about this letter. Then we start the process of tracking down rightful owners and making this right. She might not agree. She might want to keep it anyway. Then we'll find out what kind of partner we have. Maxwell stood and pulled out his phone. But something tells me she'll understand. He was right. When they met with Priscilla 2 days later and showed her the letter, she read it twice before speaking. My God, he carried this guilt for years. The question is what we do about it, Maxwell said. Priscilla set down the letter and looked at both of them. We honor his wishes, all of them. We return every stolen piece and we do it publicly. We turn his story into a lesson about redemption. Relief flooded through Maxwell. You're sure? I'm sure. My wealth didn't come from compromising my values. I'm not going to start now. She smiled slightly. Besides, we'll still have the legitimate half of the collection. That's enough to restore the castle and create something meaningful. The process of making amends took 6 months and changed everything. Dr. Philippa Strand became their guide through the complicated work of identifying rightful owners. Some were easy. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts still had records of their missing pieces from 1882, and their curator wept openly when Philippa called with the news. Others required genealogists, estate lawyers, and historians to trace family lines that had scattered across continents. Maxwell started keeping a restoration ledger, documenting each decision and return. It became a ritual, writing entries by hand each evening after work, chronicling not just what they were doing, but why it mattered. The first return happened on a cold morning in February. The Pemberton family had descendants still living in Connecticut, 3 sisters in their 70s who'd grown up hearing stories about their great-grandmother's missing constable painting. Maxwell, Lachlan, and Priscilla drove down together with the landscape carefully crated in the truck bed. The eldest sister, Dorothy, answered the door of a modest colonial house. Her hands shook as Maxwell explained who they were and why they'd come. You're returning it? After all these years? It belongs to your family. Always did. They uncrated it in her living room. All 3 sisters gathered around as the canvas emerged from its protective wrapping. Dorothy touched the frame gently, tears streaming down her face. Our great-grandmother spoke of this painting until the day she died. She said it was stolen by the art dealer she'd trusted, but no one believed her. Everyone assumed she'd sold it and forgotten. She was telling the truth, Maxwell said. And we're sorry it took this long to prove it. The sisters insisted they stay for lunch. Over sandwiches and tea, they shared stories of their great-grandmother, a woman who'd loved art but lost faith in collectors after the theft. The painting had represented more than its monetary value. It had been a wound that never quite healed. "What will you do with it now?" Priscilla asked. Dorothy looked at her sisters, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Sell it, I think. Use the money to establish a scholarship in our great-grandmother's name." She would have liked that better than having it hang in our living room. On the drive back, nobody spoke for the first hour. Finally, Lachlan broke the silence. "That felt good. Really good." Maxwell glanced at his son and saw something he hadn't seen in months: genuine satisfaction. Not excitement over money or treasure, but the deep contentment that comes from doing something meaningful. The returns continued. The ivory sculptures went to a museum in Philadelphia, where Horace Brennan's descendants had donated his other collections. 3 paintings returned to the Boston Museum, where they planned a special exhibition about recovered art. Each return brought letters of gratitude, sometimes tears, occasionally disbelief that anyone would voluntarily give up such valuable pieces. The local and national press picked up the story. "Family chooses honor over fortune," read one headline. "Stolen art returned after 130 years," proclaimed another. Maxwell did a few interviews, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that telling Cornelius's story mattered. The narrative wasn't just about theft, it was about redemption, about making right what had been wrong, about valuing integrity over wealth. The legitimate half of the collection, still worth several $1 million, began to sell. A smaller Constable landscape went to a private collector for $2.8 million. A set of rare manuscripts sold to a university for $300,000. Each sale was handled through proper channels with full documentation, and the money went directly into the foundation Priscilla had established. The Greymore Castle Restoration Foundation had 3 purposes: restore the castle as a museum and cultural center, support arts education in rural communities, and maintain the remaining collection for public benefit. Priscilla matched every dollar that came from art sales, and other donors began contributing as word spread. Meanwhile, Hugo Fairfax and his crew worked steadily on the castle itself. The roof was replaced completely, a massive project that took 12 weeks and most of their initial budget. Windows were repaired or replaced. Structural issues were addressed methodically, working from foundation to rafters. The castle slowly transformed from ruin to possibility. Maxwell divided his time between the garage and the castle, often working 16-hour days. His hands, already permanently stained with engine oil, developed new calluses from carpentry work. Lachlan threw himself into the project with an energy Maxwell hadn't seen since his son was a teenager, with dreams still intact. One evening in late July, they stood together in the great hall. The space had been cleared of debris, the floor cleaned and repaired, new lighting installed. It was still obviously a work in progress, but you could see what it might become. "We're going to make it," Lachlan said, looking around. "This is actually going to work. Starting to look that way. I've been thinking about something." Lachlan turned to face his father. "When the castle opens, I want to run the education programs. I've been talking with Priscilla, and she thinks we could bring in artists for residencies, offer workshops for kids, maybe partner with schools in the region." Maxwell studied his son. "You'd be good at that. But what about going back to the city? Starting another business?" "I don't want to go back. What we're building here matters more than anything I was doing before. I just needed to find the right thing to build." They were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Priscilla emerged from her Mercedes, but she wasn't alone. A younger woman in her 30s accompanied her, carrying a laptop bag. "Maxwell, Lachlan, this is Vanessa Chen. She's a journalist writing a book about art restitution. I thought she should hear your story directly. The interview took 3 hours." Vanessa asked detailed questions about everything: finding the chest, reading Cornelius's confession, the decision to return the stolen pieces, the reactions of the families involved. She was particularly interested in the emotional journey, what it felt like to choose integrity over wealth. Most people wouldn't make that choice, she said, looking directly at Maxwell. The temptation to keep it would be overwhelming. The temptation was there, Maxwell admitted. Still is some days when I look at the bills for castle repairs. But keeping it would have meant living with a lie. I've spent my life fixing things. Seemed wrong not to fix this too, even if fixing it cost me. Vanessa closed her notebook. This is going to be the centerpiece of my book. A real example of moral courage in a world that doesn't value it enough. After she left, Priscilla lingered. There's something else we need to discuss. The stolen pieces are all returned or donated. The legitimate collection is providing funds for restoration. But I've been thinking about one more step. What's that? Opening day. 6 months from now, ideally. We invite everyone who received returned art, show them what their losses helped build. Make it a celebration of redemption, not just restoration. Maxwell liked the idea immediately. Cornelius would approve. I think so too. He wanted this place to mean something. Let's make sure it does. They set the date for February 15th, exactly 1 year after the first piece had been returned. Invitations would go out in the fall. The castle would open not just as a museum, but as a living monument to the idea that mistakes could be corrected, that guilt could find resolution, that even across the barrier of death, amends could be made. As Priscilla drove away, Maxwell looked up at the castle against the evening sky. It was still incomplete, still rough around the edges, but it stood solid and purposeful. Like him, like Lachlan, like the second chance they'd all been given. Sometimes the inheritance you receive isn't what you expected. Sometimes it's better. The opening ceremony was scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Saturday that dawned clear and cold. Maxwell stood in the castle's great hall at 7, watching volunteers arrange chairs in neat rows, while caterers set up tables along the back wall. His hands were clean for once. He'd scrubbed them 3 times that morning, and he wore the only suit he owned, purchased 20 years ago for his father's funeral. You look nervous, Priscilla said, appearing at his elbow. She wore a deep green dress that somehow made her look both elegant and approachable. Terrified. I'm a mechanic. I fix cars. I don't give speeches to crowds. You'll be fine. Just speak from the heart like you always do. The guests began arriving at 9:30. The Pemberton sisters came first. Dorothy using a walker, but determined to see the castle that had become part of their family story. Behind them came representatives from the Boston Museum, the Philadelphia Collection, a dozen other institutions and families who'd received returned artwork. Dr. Strand arrived with a contingent from her university. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras ready. The people of Riverside came too. Betty from the post office, Bill Hutchins from the hardware store, Reverend Paul, Martha Quincy the librarian. Even the ones who'd predicted disaster stood in the crowd, their expressions a mix of surprise and grudging respect. Hugo Fairfax and his entire crew occupied the back rows, men in clean work shirts who'd turned a ruin into something remarkable. By 10 o'clock, 200 people filled the great hall. Lachlan stood beside Maxwell near the front, straightening his father's tie one more time. You've got this, Dad. Maxwell stepped forward as Priscilla introduced him. The crowd quieted, faces turning his direction expectantly. He looked out at all of them, strangers and neighbors, wealthy and working class, young and old, and felt his prepared remarks dissolve in his head. I'm not good at speeches, he began, his voice rough. I'm better with wrenches than words. But I want to tell you about a man I never met who changed my life. He told Cornelius's story simply, without embellishment. A successful art dealer who let greed corrupt his ethics. A thief who couldn't enjoy what he'd stolen. A dying man who left a confession and a plea for redemption. The audience listened in absolute silence. When I found what he'd hidden, I had a choice. Keep it and change my circumstances, or return it and honor a dead man's wishes. I won't pretend it was easy. My son and I have struggled financially our whole lives. The temptation was real. Maxwell glanced at Lachlan, who nodded encouragingly. But I kept thinking about what I wanted my son to learn from this. Not that wealth is the goal, but that integrity matters. That doing right is more important than doing well. That sometimes the best inheritance isn't money, it's character. He gestured around the hall. This castle exists because a lot of people chose to value something beyond profit. Priscilla Ashworth, who could have fought me in court but chose partnership instead. Dr. Strand, who gave countless hours to help us navigate complex ethical waters. Hugo Fairfax and his crew, who brought this building back from the edge of collapse. And all of you who received stolen artwork and responded not with anger but with grace. Dorothy Pemberton raised her hand slightly from her seat, a gesture of acknowledgement. Cornelius Thornley died ashamed of what he'd done. But today we complete his redemption. This castle is no longer a monument to his crimes. It's a symbol of restoration, of buildings, of art, of trust, of family bonds. Starting today, it belongs to all of you. Come learn here, create here, find inspiration here. That's what Cornelius hoped for. That's what we built. The applause started slowly, then built like a wave. Maxwell stepped back, his face flushed, relieved it was over. Priscilla took his place and spoke about the foundation, the education programs, the partnerships they'd established. Her speech was more polished, more professional, but Maxwell barely heard it. He was watching the faces in the crowd, seeing genuine emotion there, and feeling something he'd rarely experienced, pride in what he'd accomplished. After the ceremony, guests toured the castle. The rooms they'd completed, the library, 3 restored bedrooms, the dining hall, showed what the finished castle would eventually look like. The spaces still under construction were roped off, but visible, allowing people to see the work in progress. In the library, they'd created a display about Cornelius's collection. Photographs of each piece, documentation of where it had gone, letters from the families who'd received returned artwork. At the center was the original confession letter in a climate-controlled case. Visitors read it with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. Maxwell found himself cornered by a reporter from the state newspaper. "Mr. Thornley, you've given up approximately $5 million in returned artwork. Do you regret that decision?" "Not for a second. That money was never mine to begin with, but you could have kept it. No one would have known. I would have known. My son would have known. That's enough." The reporter scribbled notes. "One more question. What's next for you?" Maxwell considered. "I keep running my garage. Keep working on the castle as funds allow. Keep trying to be someone my son can be proud of. That's it? No grand plans. Sometimes the simple things matter most." By mid-afternoon, the formal events concluded and people began to leave. The Pemberton sisters approached Maxwell before departing. "Thank you," Dorothy said, taking his hand in both of hers. "You gave us back more than a painting. You validated our great-grandmother's truth. That means everything." After they left, Maxwell walked through the castle alone. In each restored room, he saw not just the physical work, but the choices that had led here. The decision to honor Cornelius's wishes. The partnership with Priscilla. The returns that had cost millions, but gained something more valuable. The slow, steady work of building something meaningful. He found Lachlan on the ramparts, looking out over the forest that surrounded the castle. "You did good, Dad. That speech, it was perfect. It was honest. That's all I know how to be." They stood together in the fading light, father and son, watching the last guests depart down the long drive. The castle rose solid behind them, no longer abandoned, no longer a ruin, no longer a secret. It had become what Cornelius hoped for, a place of learning, of beauty, of redemption. "You know what the best part is?" Lachlan said. "We did this together. Every choice, every challenge, together." Maxwell put his arm around his son's shoulders. "That's the real inheritance. Not the castle or the art or any of it. Just us, figuring out how to do right by each other and everyone else." Below them, Hugo Fairfax and his crew were packing up equipment. The caterers cleaned the great hall. Life was settling back into routine, but a routine transformed by purpose and meaning. Maxwell thought about Cornelius one last time. A flawed man who'd made terrible choices but left behind the hope that someone would correct them. Mission accomplished, Maxwell thought. Rest easy. The castle bell, silent for 60 years, had been restored the week before. Maxwell reached for the rope and pulled. The deep, resonant tone rolled across the valley, announcing to anyone listening that Greymore Castle had come home. 3 months after the opening, Maxwell stood in the castle's entrance hall, watching a group of high school students sketch in notebooks. Their teacher, a woman from 2 counties over, had brought them for a day-long workshop. Lachlan was leading them through the library, talking about the history of the building and the artwork that had once been hidden in its walls. "We get about 200 visitors a week now," Priscilla said, joining Maxwell by the window. "More than I projected for the first year. People are curious. They want to see what redemption looks like. It helps that your story went viral. That journalist's book excerpt got picked up everywhere." She handed him a magazine. "You've been written about in The Atlantic." Maxwell glanced at the article, but didn't read it. He'd grown weary of seeing his name in print, of being held up as some kind of moral exemplar. He'd just done what seemed right. The attention made him uncomfortable. "There's something I want to show you," Priscilla said, leading him upstairs to what had been the master bedroom. It was now an office, shared by her and Lachlan, when they were managing foundation business. On the desk sat a leather-bound book, clearly new. She opened it to reveal pages filled with handwriting, different styles, different hands, different stories. "A visitor book?" Maxwell asked. "More than that. People have been leaving messages about their own experiences, with restitution, forgiveness, making amends." "Read a few." Maxwell picked up the book and read randomly selected entries. A woman who'd returned money stolen from her employer 20 years ago. A man who'd tracked down a family heirloom his grandfather had taken during wartime. A teenager who'd confessed to cheating and accepted the consequences. Page after page of people inspired to confront their own compromises and make them right. "Cornelius's story is bigger than just art," Priscilla said quietly. "It's about how we handle our failures, whether we let them define us or whether we find ways to correct them." Maxwell closed the book carefully. He'd be amazed by all this, probably overwhelmed. I think he'd be grateful. You gave him something he couldn't give himself, absolution. That evening, Maxwell drove back to Riverside alone. Lachlan was staying at the castle for a week-long summer arts program he'd organized. The garage felt empty without his son there, but it was a good kind of empty. The kind that came from people growing into their purpose rather than running from failure. He made himself dinner, nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast, and ate at the kitchen table with Cornelius's original confession letter spread before him. He'd read it so many times he had parts memorized, but tonight he looked at it with fresh eyes. The letter had been a burden passed across time, a dying man's hope that someone would be better than he'd been. Maxwell had accepted that burden and carried it through, not perfectly, not without doubt, but faithfully. And in doing so, he'd found something he hadn't known he was missing, a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. His phone rang. Lachlan's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, Dad, just wanted to say goodnight. The kids are settled in. Tomorrow we're starting pottery workshops. Sounds good. You need anything?" "No, we're fine. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For showing me what matters. I came home thinking I'd failed at everything that counted. But you taught me that success isn't about money or status. It's about living with integrity and building something meaningful. This work we're doing at the castle, it's the most important thing I've ever been part of." Maxwell's throat tightened. "You're the best thing I ever built, Lachlan. Everything else is just detail." After they hung up, Maxwell sat for a long time in the quiet kitchen. Through the window he could see the garage, dark now, waiting for Monday morning, when he'd open the bay doors and get back to work. Cars would come with their problems, and he'd fix them one at a time, same as always. But he wasn't the same. The inheritance had changed him, not by making him wealthy, but by giving him the chance to prove what he valued. To stand at a crossroads and choose the harder path because it was the right one. He thought about the castle, standing solid in the forest, about the families who'd received their stolen heirlooms, about the students learning to create beauty in those restored halls. All of it connected back to one old man's confession and another man's decision to honor it. Maxwell folded the letter and returned it to its protective sleeve. Tomorrow he'd take it back to the castle where it belonged, part of the permanent exhibition. But tonight he held on to it a little longer, this paper bridge between generations, this testament to failure and redemption, this proof that it's never too late to try making things right. Outside, Riverside settled into sleep. Inside, a mechanic with stained hands and a clear conscience finished his eggs and prepared for another ordinary day. Some inheritances are measured in dollars. The ones that matter are measured in changed lives. Opening day arrived 6 months later on a brilliant morning in late September. Maxwell stood at the castle entrance, wearing the same suit from the preview ceremony, now tailored to fit properly after Priscilla had insisted he look the part. Around him, the grounds had been transformed. Landscaping complete, paths paved, signage installed directing visitors to parking areas and picnic spaces. The official grand opening drew nearly 500 people. News vans lined the drive. Politicians came to cut ribbons and make speeches about community values. But Maxwell paid attention to the ordinary folks, families from surrounding counties, teachers bringing students, elderly couples, who remembered when the castle had been abandoned and thought it would stay that way forever. Lachlan stood beside him, greeting visitors, confident in a way Maxwell had never seen before. His son wore a name tag identifying him as education director, and he moved through the crowd with easy authority, answering questions about programs and exhibitions. "You've come a long way," Maxwell said during a quiet moment. "We both have. A year ago, I was sleeping on your couch wondering what to do with my life. Now I'm running programs that matter." The ribbon cutting happened at noon. Priscilla made brief remarks about the Foundation's mission. Maxwell spoke even more briefly, thanking everyone who'd made restoration possible. Then together they cut the ceremonial ribbon and the first official visitors streamed inside. The castle was beautiful. The great hall gleamed with restored stonework and period-appropriate lighting. The library held not just books, but interactive displays about art history and conservation. Former bedrooms had become galleries showcasing rotating exhibitions from regional artists. The dining hall served as an event space, already booked for weddings and conferences months in advance. But Maxwell's favorite space was the small chapel on the ground floor. They'd restored it simply, keeping the worn stone and aged wood, adding only better lighting and comfortable seating. On one wall hung a bronze plaque with Cornelius's story, not hiding his crimes, but not glorifying them either. Just the facts of what he'd done and what his heirs had chosen to do afterward. Below the plaque sat a wooden box where visitors could leave notes. Maxwell checked it periodically and found confessions, gratitude, questions about forgiveness. The chapel had become what he'd hoped, a place for reflection on human imperfection and the possibility of redemption. By late afternoon, the official events concluded. Most visitors had gone home. Maxwell walked through the quieter halls, savoring the sounds of the building alive with purpose. Children's laughter from an art room, tour guide voices explaining architectural features, footsteps echoing on stone floors that had been silent for 60 years. He found Priscilla on the ramparts where he and Lachlan had stood after the preview ceremony. She was looking out over the forest, the autumn leaves just beginning to turn. "We did it," she said simply. "You had doubts?" "Every single day, especially when the contractor came back with revised estimates," she smiled. "But yes, we did it. Cornelius would be proud. I think he'd be relieved more than proud. His burden is finally lifted." They stood in comfortable silence until Lachlan joined them, bringing the news that the day's visitor count had exceeded projections. "People are already asking about season passes," he reported. "And we got 3 new inquiries about hosting school groups." Maxwell looked at his son and his unexpected partner, these 2 people who'd helped him transform inherited guilt into active grace. The castle rose solid around them, no longer a ruin or even a restoration project. It was simply home now, to art and education, to community gatherings and quiet reflection, to second chances and new beginnings. "I need to get back to Riverside," Maxwell said. "I got a transmission job waiting Monday morning." "You're still working at the garage?" Priscilla asked, surprised. "Of course. That's who I am. He gestured at the castle. "This is something I helped build. But my work is fixing engines and keeping cars running. That hasn't changed." Lachlan walked him to his truck. You know you don't have to work anymore, right? The foundation could pay you for the time you spend here. I know. But I like my work. Like the people who trust me with their vehicles. Like coming home with oil under my fingernails. Maxwell opened the truck door. Besides, you need to run this place without your old man hovering. You're not old. Old enough. And proud enough of you to let you do this your way. They embraced, and Maxwell climbed into his truck. In the rear-view mirror, he watched Lachlan wave from the castle steps, the building golden in the late afternoon sun. The boy he'd raised alone had become a man with purpose. The castle they'd saved had become something larger than either of them had imagined. Maxwell drove home through the lengthening shadows, past forests and fields, back toward the small town and smaller garage where his real life waited. The inheritance had changed everything and nothing. He was still a mechanic, still struggling some months to make bills, but he was also the man who'd chosen honor over fortune, redemption over wealth, integrity over ease. That inheritance of character over comfort was the one worth passing on.